called IDM 2.0, that includes investments in manufacturing facilities, use of both internal and external foundries, and a new foundry business called Intel Foundry Services, IFS, a standalone business unit. 125, 126. Unlike Intel Custom Foundry, IFS will offer a combination of packaging and process technology, and Intel's IP portfolio including x86 cores. Other plans for the company include a partnership with IBM and a new event for developers and engineers, called Intel On. 90. Schlesinger also confirmed that Intel's 7nm process is on track, and that the first products with 7nm, it is now called Intel 4, are Ponte Vecchio and Meteor Lake. 90. In January 2022, Intel reportedly selected New Albany, Ohio, near Columbus, Ohio, as the site for a major new manufacturing facility. 127. The facility will cost at least $20 billion. 128. The company expects the facility to begin producing chips by 2025. 129. The same year Intel also chose Magdeburg, Germany, as a site for 2 new chip megafactories for €17 billion, topping Tesla's investment in Brandenburg. Groundbreaking is planned for 2023, while a production start is planned for 2027. Including subcontractors, this would create 10,000 new jobs. 130. In August 2022, Intel signed a $30 billion partnership with Brookfield Asset Management to fund its recent factory expansions. As part of the deal, Intel would have a controlling stake by funding 51% of the cost of building new chip-making facilities in Chandler, with Brookfield owning the remaining 49% stake, allowing the companies to split their revenue from those facilities. 131, 132. Product and market history. SRAMs, DRAMs, and the microprocessor. Intel's first products were shift register memory and random access memory integrated circuits, and Intel grew to be a ladder in the fiercely competitive DRAM, SRAM, and ROM markets throughout the 1970s. Concurrently, Intel engineers Marcian Horth, Federico Fagin, Stanley Maser and Masatoshi Shima invented Intel's first microprocessor. Originally developed for the Japanese company Bizicom to replace a number of ASICs in a calculator already produced by Bizicom, the Intel 4004 was introduced to the mass market on the 15th of November, 1971, though the microprocessor did not become the core of Intel's business until the mid-1980s. Note: Intel is usually given credit with Texas Instruments for the almost simultaneous invention of the microprocessor. In 1983, at the dawn of the personal computer era, Intel's profits came under increased pressure from Japanese memory chip manufacturers, and then President Andy Grove focused the company on microprocessors. Grove described this transition in the book Only the Paranoid Survive. A key element of his plan was the notion, then considered radical, of becoming the single source for successors to the popular 8086 microprocessor. Until then, the manufacture of complex integrated circuits was not reliable enough for customers to depend on a single supplier, but Grove began producing processors in 3 geographically distinct factories, and ceased licensing the chip designs to competitors such as AMD. 133. When the PC industry boomed in the late 1980s and 1990s, Intel was one of primary beneficiaries. Early x86 processors and the IBM PC. Despite the ultimate importance of the microprocessor, the 4004 and its successors the 8008 and the 8080 were never major revenue contributors at Intel. As the next processor, the 8086, and its variant the 8088, was completed in 1978. Intel embarked on a major marketing and sales campaign for that chip nicknamed Operation Crush, and intended to win as many customers for the processor as possible. One design win was the newly created IBM PC division, though the importance of this was not fully realized at the time. IBM introduced its personal computer in 1981, and it was rapidly successful. In 1982, Intel created the 80286 microprocessor, which, 2 years later, was used in the IBM PC/AT. Compaq, the first IBM PC clone manufacturer, produced a desktop system based on the faster 80286 processor in 1985, and in 1986 quickly followed with the first 80386 based system, beating IBM and establishing a competitive market for PC-compatible systems and setting up Intel as a key component supplier. The die from an Intel 8742, an 8-bit microcontroller that includes a CPU running at 12 MHz, 128 bytes of IM, 2048 bytes of EPROM, and E/O in the same chip. In 1975, the company had started a project to develop a highly advanced 32-bit microprocessor, finally released in 1981 as the Intel IAPX 432. The project was so ambitious and the processor was never able to meet its performance objectives, and it failed in the marketplace. Intel extended the x86 architecture to 32 bits instead. 134, 135, 386 microprocessor. During this period, Andrew Grove dramatically redirected the company, closing much of its DRAM business and directing resources to the microprocessor business. Of perhaps greater importance was his decision to single-source the 386 microprocessor. Prior to this, microprocessor manufacturing was in its infancy, and manufacturing problems frequently reduced or stopped production, interrupting supplies to customers. To mitigate this risk, these customers typically insisted that multiple manufacturers produce chips they could use to ensure a consistent supply. The 8080 and 8086 series microprocessors were reproduced by several companies, notably AMD, with which Intel had a technology-sharing contract. Grove made the decision not to license the 386 design to other manufacturers, instead, producing it in 3 geographically distinct factories: Santa Clara, California, Hillsboro, Oregon, and Chandler, a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona. He convinced customers that this would ensure consistent delivery. In doing this, Intel breached its contract with AMD, which sued and was paid millions of dollars in damages but could not manufacture new Intel CPU designs any longer. Instead, AMD started to develop and manufacture its own competing x86 designs. As the success of Compaq's Desk Pro 386 established the 386 as the dominant CPU choice, Intel achieved a position of near-exclusive dominance as its supplier. Profits from this funded rapid development of both higher performance chip designs and higher performance manufacturing capabilities, propelling Intel to a position of unquestioned leadership of early 1990s. 486. Pentium, and Titanium. Intel introduced the 486 microprocessor in 1989, and in 1990 established a second design team, designing the processors code-named 5P and 6P in parallel and committing to a major new processor every 2 years, versus 4 or more years such designs had previously taken. Engineers Vinod Dham and Rajiv Chandrasekhar, Member of Parliament, India, were key figures on the core team that invented the 486 chip and later, Intel's signature Pentium chip. The 5P project was earlier known as Operation Bicycle, referring to the cycles of the processor through two parallel execute ion pipelines. The 5P was introduced in 1993 as the Intel Pentium, substituting a registered trademark name. Fourth, former part numbers, such as 486, cannot be legally registered as trademarks in the United States. The P6 followed in 1995 as the Pentium Pro and improved into the Pentium II in 1997. New architectures were developed alternately in Santa Clara, California and Hillsboro, Oregon. The Santa Clara design team embarked in 1993 on a successor to the x86 architecture, codenamed P7. The first attempt was dropped a year later but quickly revived in a cooperative program with Hewlett-Packard engineers, though Intel soon took over primary design responsibility. The resulting implementation of the IA64 64-bit architecture was the Itanium, finally introduced in June 2001. The Itanium's performance running legacy x86 code did not meet expectations, and it failed to compete effectively with x86-64, which was AMD's 64-bit extension of the 32-bit x86 architecture. Intel uses the name Intel 64, previously M64T. In 2017, Intel announced that the Itanium 9700 series, Kitesen, would be the last Itanium chips produced. 136, 137. The Hillsboro team designed the Willamette processors, initially codenamed 68P, which were marketed as the Pentium 4. During this period, Intel undertook two major supporting advertising campaigns. The first campaign, the 1991 Intel Inside Marketing and Branding campaign, is widely known and has become synonymous with Intel itself. The idea of ingredient branding was new at the time, with only NutraSweet and a few others making attempts to do so. 138. This campaign established Intel, which had been a component supplier little known outside the PC industry, as a household name. The second campaign, Intel Systems Group, which began in the early 1990s, showcased manufacturing of PEEK motherboards, the main board component of a personal computer, and the one into which the processor, CPU, and memory, RAM, chips are plugged. 139. The Systems Group campaign was lesser known than the Intel Inside campaign. Shortly after, Intel began manufacturing fully configured white box systems for the dozens of PC clone companies that rapidly sprang up. At its peak in the mid-1990s, Intel manufactured over 15% of all PCs, making it the third largest supplier at the time. During the 1990s, Intel Architecture Labs, IAL, was responsible for many of the hardware innovations for the PC, including the PCI bus, the PCI Express, PCIe bus, and Universal Serial Bus, USB. IAL's software efforts met with a more mixed fate. Its video and graphics software was important in the development of software digital video, but later its efforts were largely overshadowed by competition from Microsoft. The competition between Intel and Microsoft was revealed in testimony by then IAL Vice President Stephen McGiddy at the Microsoft antitrust trial, United States v. Microsoft Corporation. Pentium flaw. In June 1994, Intel engineers discovered a flaw in the floating point math subsection of the 5P Pentium microprocessor. Under certain data-dependent conditions, the low-order bits of the result of a floating point division would be incorrect. The error could compound in subsequent calculations. Intel corrected the error in a future chip revision, and under public pressure it issued a total recall and replaced the defective Pentium CPUs, which were limited to some 60, 66, 7590, and 100 MHz models, 140, on customer request. The bug was discovered independently in October 1994 by Thomas Nicely, professor of mathematics at Lynchburg College. He contacted Intel but received no response. On the 30th of October, he posted a message about his finding on the internet. 141. Word of the bug spread quickly and reached the industry press. The bug was easy to replicate. A user could enter specific numbers into the calculator on the operating system. Consequently, many users did not accept Intel statements that the error was minor and not even an erratum. During Thanksgiving, in 1994, the New York Times ran a piece by journalist John Markoff spotlighting the error. Intel changed its position and offered to replace every chip, quickly putting in place a large end-user support organization. This resulted in a $475 million charge against Intel's 1994 revenue. 142. Dr. Nicely later learned that Intel had discovered the FDIV bug in its own testing a few months before him, but had decided not to inform customers. 143. The Pentium flaw incident, Intel's response to it, and the surrounding media coverage propelled Intel from being a technology supplier generally unknown to most computer users to a household name. Dovetailing with an uptick in the Intel Inside campaign, the episode is considered to have been a positive event for Intel, changing some of its business practices to be more end-user focused and generating substantial public awareness, while avoiding a lasting negative impression. 144. Intel Core. The Intel Core line originated from the original Core brand, with the release of the 32-bit Iona CPU, Intel's first dual-core mobile, low-power processor. Derived from the Pentium M, the processor family used an enhanced version of the P6 microarchitecture. Its successor, the Core 2 family, was released on the 27th of July 2006. This was based on the Intel Core microarchitecture, and was a 64-bit design. 145. Instead of focusing on higher clock rates, the Core microarchitecture emphasized power efficiency and a return to lower clock speeds. 146. It also provided more efficient decoding stages, execution units, caches, and buses, reducing the power consumption of Core 2 branded CPUs while increasing their processing capacity. In November 2008, Intel released the first generation Core processors based on the Nehalem microarchitecture. Intel also introduced a new naming scheme, with the three variants now named Core i3, i5, and i7, as well as i9 from 7th generation onwards. Unlike the previous naming scheme, these names no longer correspond to specific technical features. It was succeeded by the Westmere microarchitecture in 2010, with a die shrink to 32 nm and included Intel HD graphics. In 2011, Intel released the Sandy Bridge-based second-generation Core processor family. This generation featured an 11% performance increase over Nehalem. 147. It was succeeded by Ivy Bridge-based third-generation Core, introduced at the 2012 Intel Developer Forum. 148. Ivy Bridge featured a die shrink to 22 nm, and supported both DDR3 memory and DDR3L chips. Intel continued its tick-tock model of a microarchitecture change followed by a die shrink until the 6th generation Core family based on the Skylake microarchitecture. This model was deprecated in 2016, with the release of the 7th generation Core family based on Kaby Lake, ushering in the process architecture optimization model. 149. From 2016 until 2021, Intel later released more optimizations on the Skylake microarchitecture with Kaby Lake R, Amber Lake, Whiskey Lake, Coffee Lake R, and Comet Lake. 150, 151, 152, 153. Intel struggled to shrink their process node from 14 nm to 10 nm, with the first microarchitecture under that node, Cannon Lake. Marketed as 8th generation